What would you do if the people who raised you, the people you trusted most in the world, were ripped from your life in the dead of night? And the shock didn't end there, because the person responsible was not a stranger, but someone you called family. This isn't a plot from a Hollywood thriller. This is the reality that struck the Reiner family, a household once celebrated for its warmth, love, and connection to Hollywood royalty. Rob Reiner, the legendary filmmaker whose name evokes classics from This Is Spinal Tap to When Harry Met Sally, and his beloved wife Michelle, a devoted mother and social presence, were found brutally murdered in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The details are chilling, almost surreal. Multiple sharp force injuries, a crime scene that stunned law enforcement, and a twist that would leave the nation gasping. But the true shock didn't stop at the gruesome act itself. It lay in who was implicated and why. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story, as it unfolds, reads like a cautionary tale that Hollywood screenwriters might have been too cautious to imagine. Rob and Michelle Reiner, 78 and 70 respectively, were beloved by friends, colleagues, and fans alike. They had built a life filled with creativity, social engagement, and family love. Their son, Nick, 32, lived in the guest house of their estate, a young man with potential and privilege, whose life seemed intertwined with the promise of success. Yet, on that fateful night, everything changed. Nick was arrested at the scene, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the world collectively recoiled. How could such horror emerge from what appeared to be a safe, affluent, and loving family environment? And yet, as shocking as Nick's alleged involvement was, the narrative grew darker, more complicated, and far more emotionally devastating. Tracy Reiner, Rob's daughter from a previous marriage, delivered a confession in court that left the nation reeling. She had admitted to orchestrating the act by hiring her wayward brother to carry it out. The emotional weight of such an admission is almost impossible to convey. A daughter, confessor, and orchestrator, all at once, speaking in a courtroom filled with media, friends, family, and law enforcement. Her revelation reframed the tragedy from a horrifying act of violence to a complex web of betrayal, secrecy, and twisted family dynamics. Before we even dive into the events of that night, it's crucial to understand the family at the center of this storm. Rob Reiner is a household name, but beyond the accolades, he was a father, husband, and figure whose life was deeply intertwined with Hollywood history. His influence stretched beyond cinema. He shaped the cultural conversation, engaged in political activism, and maintained a public persona that many admired for its authenticity. Michelle, by his side, contributed to a life marked by creativity, social awareness, and familial dedication. Their home was more than a mansion. It was a symbol of success, stability, and love. And yet, behind the facade, layers of tension, sibling rivalry, and personal struggles had begun to take shape, creating the kind of fertile ground where tragedy could bloom. In the opening moments of public awareness about the murders, friends and neighbors were stunned. Many described the Reiners as a picture-perfect family, the kind you see in magazines, admired for their harmony and presence. But as investigators combed through the estate, piecing together timelines, statements, and forensic evidence, a different story emerged. Subtle frictions, hidden resentments, and long-standing conflicts began to surface, painting a picture that was as complex emotionally as it was legally. It was the kind of story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How well can we truly know those we love? How often do appearances hide painful realities? And in the context of a family, can betrayal strike deeper than anyone might imagine? Tracy's confession intensified these questions. Unlike many crimes that shocked because of the randomness of the violence, this crime shocked because it was rooted in relationships, in trust, in the very bonds that are supposed to protect us. To understand the gravity of her admission, one must consider the stakes involved. Legal consequences, public scrutiny, moral judgment, and, perhaps most poignantly, the personal torment of acknowledging responsibility for an act that destroyed parents, family, and the illusion of safety. Her emotional breakdown, recorded and broadcasted, provided a rare glimpse into the human capacity for guilt, remorse, and paradoxically, calculated action. The case also underscores the role of fame and wealth in shaping both perception and reality. In a different setting, such a crime might have remained a quiet, tragic incident. Here, however, the world was watching. Every word, every gesture, every tear was amplified by media attention. Social media erupted with speculation, grief, and outrage. Audiences were captivated, not just by the sensational details, but by the humanity behind them. The fear, the desperation, the unimaginable weight of family betrayal. It is a stark reminder that public figures, regardless of privilege or status, are not immune to the darkest elements of human behavior. To fully appreciate the events that led to that night, we must explore the dynamics that preceded it. Childhood memories, sibling rivalries, parental expectations, and unspoken resentments all converge to form a tapestry of tension that, over time, reached a tipping point. Tracy and Nick, despite shared bloodlines, had very different personalities, life experiences, and coping mechanisms. Understanding their individual motivations, insecurities, and grievances is key to comprehending how tragedy unfolded in what appeared to be a protective and loving environment. It's worth noting that the legal investigation itself has been as meticulous as it is dramatic. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed that both Rob and Michelle died from multiple sharp force injuries, leaving little doubt about the brutality of the crime. But beyond the physical evidence lies a deeper story, one of motive, orchestration, and emotional manipulation. Tracy's confession, in particular, introduces layers of complexity. How far can personal vendettas, feelings of injustice, or perceived slights push a person? And how does a family navigate the aftermath of such revelations? As we explore this case, we will also examine the broader implications. It is a story that forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about family, loyalty, and morality. It challenges the notion that wealth and fame provide protection, and it underscores the fragility of trust. Every revelation, every courtroom statement, every tear and gesture offers insight not just into the Reiner family, but into the human condition itself. We are left to grapple with questions of justice, accountability, and the moral ambiguities that make this story so compelling and so tragic. Even as the world grapples with the details, one thing remains certain. This is not a story with easy answers. Each twist reveals new dimensions of betrayal, heartbreak, and human complexity. Tracy Reiner's confession did more than shock a courtroom. It sent ripples through Hollywood, social circles, and public consciousness. It forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about loyalty, morality, and the bonds that define a family. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges us, as an audience, to ask ourselves how we might act when confronted with betrayal so intimate, so personal, that it shatters the very foundation of our understanding of love and trust. So, as we begin this deep dive into the Reiner family tragedy, consider this. What would you do if the people you trusted most became the center of unimaginable horror? Could you forgive? Could you survive? Could you even comprehend the emotional calculus that led to such a devastating confession? The answers are not simple, and the journey through this story will force us to confront uncomfortable realities. Truths about family, morality, and the human psyche that are as compelling as they are horrifying. No one knew what was lurking behind the gates of the Reiner estate. On the surface, it was the picture of Hollywood success, a sprawling Brentwood mansion surrounded by manicured gardens, security cameras, and a sense of serene privilege. From the outside looking in, Rob and Michelle Reiner's life seemed enviable. Rob, a legendary filmmaker, had built a career that spanned decades, shaping not just movies but popular culture itself. Michelle, elegant, socially engaged, and fiercely devoted to her family, was the anchor of the household. The children, Nick, Tracy, and Romy, all carried the weight of the Reiner name, navigating the pressures, expectations, and privileges that came with it. Neighbors recalled seeing laughter echo from the estate, parties with Hollywood figures, and family gatherings that seemed warm and untroubled. Friends would describe Rob as charming, wise, and engaging, someone who could make anyone feel at ease in his presence. Michelle, equally admired, was known for her generosity and warmth. On the surface, there were no signs of impending tragedy. Yet, as with many families, appearances can be deceiving. Even in families that appear flawless, tensions often simmer beneath the surface. The Reiners were no exception. Nick, the youngest son, had lived in the guest house for years. While outwardly he seemed a typical young adult navigating life, reports suggested he struggled with personal issues that remained largely private. His relationships with family members were complex, layered with both love and friction. Tracy, Rob's daughter from a previous marriage, had a strong personality, one shaped by independence and a sense of responsibility toward her siblings. Romy, the youngest, had her own dynamic with the family, often observing the tensions between her siblings from a quieter, more removed perspective. Family life is a delicate ecosystem. Small slights, perceived injustices, and unspoken resentments can accumulate like hidden cracks in a foundation. In the Reiner household, certain patterns were beginning to emerge. Friends hinted at subtle rivalries, particularly between Nick and Tracy, though few could have predicted how these tensions would escalate into tragedy. Like many families, there was love, loyalty, and devotion, but also frustration, disappointment, and the complicated emotions that simmer quietly behind closed doors. The facade of perfection was maintained through carefully curated appearances. Social media posts, public events, and Hollywood parties all contributed to an image of harmony and success. But behind closed doors, emotions ran hotter, disagreements lingered longer, and the pressure of living up to the Reiner name added layers of stress. Family members often compartmentalized their struggles, hiding vulnerabilities that, left unresolved, can fester into something far more dangerous than simple sibling rivalry. Rob and Michelle worked tirelessly to provide stability, guidance, and a nurturing environment. Their parenting style emphasized responsibility, creativity, and independence. However, even the best-intentioned guidance can sometimes be misunderstood, misinterpreted, or resisted by children who are struggling with personal demons. In the case of Nick and Tracy, the mix of expectations, personal frustrations, and unaddressed grievances created an environment ripe for conflict. Looking at the Reiners from a psychological perspective, one sees the interplay of privilege, expectation, and identity. Nick, as a young adult living under the shadow of his famous father, faced pressures that many cannot imagine. Tracy, on the other hand, navigated her own identity as Rob's daughter, balancing admiration for her father with a growing sense of agency and personal ambition. Both siblings had individual motivations, insecurities, and unresolved emotional issues that, while hidden from the public eye, shaped their interactions, decisions, and perceptions of one another. Despite these tensions, the family maintained a public appearance of unity. On social media, they shared photos of gatherings, vacations, and celebrations. Friends and colleagues often commented on the warmth that seemed to radiate from the family, unaware of the undercurrents of tension. It is a classic dynamic. Families under scrutiny often amplify the appearance of harmony, hiding the messy, complicated truths that exist behind closed doors. Yet, cracks do not remain hidden forever. Over time, small disputes, disagreements, and miscommunications begin to accumulate. In the Reiner household, these cracks manifested in subtle ways. Moments of frustration during conversations, lingering resentments over past decisions, and private conflicts that were never fully addressed. These fissures, while invisible to outsiders, created the foundation for the storm that was about to break. One of the most important aspects of understanding this family dynamic is recognizing the role of perception. How family members perceive one another often shapes their decisions, actions, and emotional responses. Nick may have felt misunderstood or unsupported. Tracy may have felt compelled to assert control or correct perceived injustices. Romy may have sensed the tension and internalized it, unsure of how to navigate the conflicting emotions around her. Each perception, accurate or distorted, contributed to a complex web of emotional triggers that would eventually lead to catastrophe. Adding another layer to this dynamic was the influence of external pressures. Wealth and fame create environments where scrutiny, judgment, and expectation are constant. Friends, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances form opinions based on fragments of information, amplifying both praise and criticism. In the Reiner household, the weight of external perception likely compounded internal tensions. The need to maintain appearances while managing private struggles created a delicate balancing act, one that would eventually unravel with devastating consequences. It is also crucial to understand the emotional stakes. Beyond legal, financial, or social ramifications, the Reiner family tragedy is rooted in emotional complexity. Feelings of love, loyalty, anger, and resentment intersected in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. The intensity of these emotions, when combined with unresolved conflicts, creates conditions where irrational or extreme actions become possible. Tracy's eventual confession, shocking as it was, did not occur in a vacuum. It emerged from this highly charged emotional environment, shaped by years of interpersonal dynamics and unspoken grievances. As we begin to explore the events leading up to the night of the murders, it is essential to remember that the facade of perfection often conceals deeper truths. Families, especially those in the public eye, can appear flawless even as they grapple with profound internal conflict. The Reiner story reminds us that wealth, fame, and social status do not insulate against betrayal, heartbreak, or tragedy. It is a stark lesson in the unpredictability of human behavior and the hidden complexities of family life. And yet, despite these tensions, no one could have predicted the level of horror that awaited the Reiners on that fateful night. The facade would crumble, revealing not just a tragic crime, but a story of emotional manipulation, betrayal, and moral ambiguity that would shock the world. Every carefully maintained image, every social media post, every public appearance would be recontextualized in light of the events that followed. The perfect family, as seen from the outside, was a fragile illusion. Beneath the surface lay the pressures, resentments, and psychological complexities that would converge in tragedy. Understanding this foundation is crucial to comprehending not only the night of the murders, but also the motivations, choices, and confessions that would follow. It sets the stage for a story that is as psychologically rich as it is dramatically compelling. And just as the sun sets over the serene Brentwood streets, unseen by neighbors and friends, the tensions within the Reiner household were building toward a breaking point. The night that followed would shatter illusions, destroy lives, and force the world to confront the unimaginable reality that the people we trust most can, under certain circumstances, become the source of our deepest pain. Every family has its secrets. Some are small, harmless, easily brushed aside. Others simmer quietly, growing more potent with each passing year, until one day they erupt with consequences no one could have imagined. For the Reiner family, the cracks beneath their picture-perfect facade had been forming for years, almost imperceptibly, until they became impossible to ignore. On the surface, life in the Brentwood estate was enviable: wealth, influence, and the glitter of Hollywood success. But beneath the manicured lawns and polished social appearances, tensions had begun to fester. Nick Reiner, the youngest son, lived in the guest house of his parents' sprawling estate, seemingly close yet quietly distant. From childhood, Nick's relationship with his family had been complex. Loved, yes, but also scrutinized. Expectations weighed heavily on him, not just to live up to the Reiner name, but to fit into a family dynamic that sometimes felt stifling. Friends described him as quiet, reserved, and occasionally brooding. While he maintained cordial relationships with his parents, subtle signs of friction had long been present. Small disagreements over responsibility, and clashes over lifestyle choices created an undercurrent of tension that only those closest to the family could sense. Tracy Reiner, Rob's daughter from a previous marriage, had her own complex relationship with Nick. As siblings, their bond had elements of camaraderie, but also rivalry. Tracy, confident, assertive, and highly aware of family dynamics, often found herself at odds with Nick's more reserved nature. She carried her own sense of obligation to the family, particularly as someone older, someone who had witnessed more of the world and assumed certain responsibilities. Her perspective, while protective, sometimes clashed with Nick's choices, leading to moments of frustration, resentment, and quiet tension. And then there was Romy, the youngest sister, a quieter observer who often internalized the tension between her siblings. Romi's role in the family was subtle but significant. She saw and understood more than she could say, absorbing the emotional turbulence around her. While outwardly she seemed distant, her awareness of the family's underlying conflicts would later become crucial in understanding the tragic events that unfolded. The cracks in the Reiner family were not created overnight. They were the product of years of accumulation, unresolved grievances, miscommunications, and small betrayals that, when left unaddressed, grew larger over time. Nick, perhaps unknowingly, had contributed to some of these tensions by asserting his independence in ways that clashed with family expectations. Tracy, feeling both protective and frustrated, sometimes pushed back in ways that created further strain. The emotional environment was one where resentment and misunderstanding could thrive, unnoticed by outsiders who only saw the polished public image. Beyond individual personalities, there were external pressures amplifying the tensions. Wealth, fame, and public attention create a unique set of challenges. Every misstep is scrutinized, every relationship analyzed. In the Reiner household, this scrutiny added layers of stress. It wasn't just about family expectations. It was about perception, legacy, and the weight of a name that carries both admiration and assumption. Small slights could feel magnified, misunderstandings could escalate, and private frustrations could fester into more profound conflicts. Friends and neighbors who interacted with the Reiners occasionally noticed signs of strain. Perhaps it was a tense exchange between siblings, a moment of frustration, or the subtle withdrawal of one family member. These moments, when isolated, seemed inconsequential. But as a pattern emerged, it became clear that the household was far more complex than appearances suggested. Even those closest to the family sensed that the harmony projected to the outside world was, at times, fragile, maintained by effort and careful navigation rather than natural ease. Financial dynamics added another layer of complexity. The Reiner estate, valued at $13.5 million, was not just a home, but a symbol of status and security. With wealth comes responsibility, expectation, and sometimes resentment. Disagreements over inheritance, access to resources, and perceived fairness in financial matters may have subtly influenced interactions between siblings. While these issues alone are rarely the cause of tragedy, when combined with deep-seated emotional tensions, they create fertile ground for conflict. Psychologically, families like the Reiners often experience a phenomenon known as hidden hierarchy. Unspoken power dynamics that dictate who has influence, who is heard, and whose opinions matter. In this environment, minor slights can be interpreted as major affronts, and small conflicts can trigger disproportionate emotional responses. Nick, Tracy, and Romy all occupied different positions within this hierarchy, each navigating their sense of agency, control, and identity. Misalignment of expectations and misunderstandings within this framework can create tension that remains invisible to those outside the family, but highly impactful to those within it. Adding to this emotional complexity were individual personality traits. Nick's tendencies toward introspection and occasional withdrawal may have been misinterpreted by Tracy as defiance or disrespect. Tracy's assertiveness and strong sense of justice may have been seen by Nick as overbearing or controlling. Romy's quiet observation, while valuable, sometimes created a sense of isolation as she witnessed conflicts she could not influence. Each family member's perception, while valid, contributed to a web of misunderstanding that would eventually play a critical role in the tragic events that followed. Even the family's relationship with the public and media played a subtle but meaningful role. Being in the public eye adds pressure, encourages guarded behavior, and makes private disagreements feel amplified. Social media, celebrity gossip, and public appearances create an environment where families are compelled to present unity, often at the expense of authentic communication. For the Reiners, maintaining appearances may have unintentionally intensified private frustrations, as each sibling navigated the tension between public perception and private emotion. The result of these accumulating pressures was a family living in parallel realities, outwardly harmonious, inwardly strained. Small misunderstandings, past grievances, and subtle jealousies interacted with external pressures to create an emotionally charged environment. No single event caused the fracture, but the cracks were now deepening, invisible to outsiders yet impossible to ignore for those living within the house. In this environment, emotional reactions can be unpredictable. When individuals feel trapped, misunderstood, or pressured, decisions are influenced by a mix of logic, emotion, and perception of justice. In the Reiner household, the combination of personality clashes, unspoken resentment, and external scrutiny created conditions where emotional responses could escalate dangerously. The family dynamics were a ticking time bomb, and the night of the murders would serve as the spark that ignited it. As the layers of family tension continued to unfold, small warning signs went largely unnoticed. A curt remark, a withdrawn conversation, an unspoken grievance. All of these were threads in the web that would eventually entangle everyone in tragedy. For those on the outside, the family remained enviable and seemingly cohesive. But the reality, hidden behind carefully maintained appearances, was far more complex and far more dangerous. By examining these cracks, we begin to see the blueprint for what came next. Emotional tension, unresolved conflict, and the subtle misalignments of personality and expectation set the stage for decisions that would culminate in horror. Understanding this background is essential to grasping not just the events of the fateful night, but also the psychological and emotional factors that led Tracy to make her shocking confession. And as the sun set over the Reiner estate, the fractures that had been forming for years were about to be exposed. The cracks beneath the surface, invisible to most but deeply felt by those within, were poised to shatter the illusion of family harmony forever. Sunday night arrived over Brentwood with an almost deceptive calm. The sky was clear, the streets quiet, and the glow of the city in the distance suggested serenity. Yet, inside the gates of the Reiner estate, a storm was quietly building. One that no one, not even the family themselves, could have predicted in its full intensity. That night would mark a turning point, not just for the Reiners, but for a nation watching in horror as one of Hollywood's most respected families became the center of a tragedy too horrifying to imagine. The evening began like many others. Rob and Michelle had their routines, grounded in decades of family life. Dinners, casual conversations, planning for the week ahead. Their children, Nick, Tracy, and Romy, were all nearby, each wrapped up in their own lives yet orbiting the gravitational pull of the family home. Outsiders might have seen laughter, the occasional clinking of glasses, the faint strains of music in the background, a picture-perfect portrait of domesticity. But beneath that surface, the tensions we've explored were quietly coiling, tightening like a spring. Nick, living in the guest house, had spent the day in relative isolation. Reports suggest he had been introspective, quiet, perhaps even brooding. Though it's impossible to know precisely what was going through his mind, the events that would unfold were rooted in a complex emotional web. Expectations unmet, frustrations unresolved, and perhaps a sense of disconnection from a family that he simultaneously loved and resented. Meanwhile, Tracy, aware of the growing fissures in the family dynamic, was also navigating her own turbulent emotions. Her relationship with Nick was strained, a mixture of protective instinct, frustration, and unresolved grievances from years past. Romy, the youngest, watched from a distance, her intuition sensing that something was wrong, though she could not articulate it fully. As the evening deepened into night, the mood inside the estate shifted. Moments that might have seemed insignificant in isolation, a raised voice, a curt response, an uneasy silence, became part of an emotional tapestry that was fraying at the edges. The house, a symbol of wealth, security, and family love, suddenly felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Anyone observing from the outside would have seen nothing amiss, yet the undercurrents inside were growing increasingly volatile. It was around this time that the first signs of impending disaster began to surface. According to preliminary investigations and witness accounts, subtle behaviors and movements hinted at an awareness that something monumental was about to occur. Doors were closed with unusual force, footsteps echoed in tense corridors, and conversations, though quiet, were charged with emotion. The atmosphere, while outwardly calm, was thick with anticipation, a silent tension that would soon erupt into violence. Then came the moment that would change everything. What exactly happened in the early hours of the night is pieced together from a combination of forensic evidence, witness statements, and later court records. What is clear is that a violent confrontation occurred, one so brutal that it left both Rob and Michelle fatally wounded. Multiple sharp force injuries were confirmed by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office, signaling the ferocity of the attack. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, targeted act of violence, executed in a space that should have been a sanctuary. Nick was at the center of this storm. Authorities arrived at the estate to find him present, and he was quickly taken into custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest was swift, the details horrifying. Law enforcement and first responders were confronted not only with the physical devastation of the crime, but with the emotional weight of the situation. A family shattered from within. Questions swirled in the public consciousness. How could a son turn against his own parents? What led to this eruption of violence? And how did long-standing familial tensions escalate to this unimaginable climax? Yet even as Nick's arrest shocked the world, the story took an even darker turn. Tracy Reiner, Rob's daughter from a previous marriage, would later reveal a confession that reframed the narrative entirely. In court, she admitted to hiring her wayward brother to carry out the act, a revelation so shocking it left observers reeling. The idea that a daughter, a sister, a family member, could orchestrate such a horrific event challenged every assumption about loyalty, love, and the sanctity of family bonds. The confession was not only emotionally devastating. It was morally disorienting, forcing the public to confront the uncomfortable reality that human behavior is often far more complex and darker than we can anticipate. To understand the gravity of that night, it's important to examine not just the act itself, but the emotional and psychological buildup. Families are intricate networks of relationships, and when conflicts are left unresolved, when frustrations simmer unchecked, the potential for catastrophic outcomes increases. In the Reiner household, subtle resentments, unmet expectations, and psychological strain converged in a volatile mix. This is not to excuse or rationalize the violence, but to understand how a series of small, often invisible pressures can accumulate into a moment of irreversible action. The night also illuminated the duality of human behavior, the public persona versus the private reality. Rob and Michelle were revered figures, admired for their warmth, creativity, and contributions to film and culture. Their deaths forced a reevaluation of appearances. Behind the fame, behind the accolades, lay a family struggling with ordinary human challenges, sibling rivalry, generational conflict, and the complex interplay of love and resentment. The tragedy underscored a harsh truth. Even families who seem perfect in public are not immune to extraordinary dysfunction in private. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the events of the night took on an almost surreal quality. Rooms where laughter had once echoed became scenes of horror. Familiar objects, once symbols of comfort, bore witness to the violence. Forensic details, painstakingly collected, revealed a sequence of actions that were both deliberate and emotionally charged. Each discovery added to the puzzle, providing clues about motive, preparation, and execution. But perhaps most striking was the human dimension, the realization that the perpetrator was not an intruder, not a stranger, but a family member acting under the direction of another. Even in the immediate aftermath, emotions ran high. Law enforcement, friends, and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of the Reiners with the reality of the crime. Media coverage was intense, social media exploded with speculation, and public grief mingled with disbelief. The story transcended Hollywood gossip. It became a reflection on the fragility of trust, the complexity of familial relationships, and the capacity for human betrayal. And yet, despite the horror of that night, the story was far from complete. Tracy's later confession, delivered under the intense scrutiny of a courtroom, would shift the narrative from tragedy to a complex tale of orchestration, motive, and moral ambiguity. Her admission that she had hired Nick reframed the night not merely as a shocking act of violence, but as the culmination of years of tension, frustration, and emotional manipulation. The implications were staggering. This was not a spontaneous act, but one rooted in planning, coercion, and intricate familial dynamics. As dawn broke over Brentwood, the estate stood silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Police tape cordoned off the property, flashing lights reflected off the gates, and investigators meticulously documented every detail. For the Reiner family, the night had changed everything. Lives were lost, trust was shattered, and the public image of a perfect Hollywood family was forever tarnished. The questions that remained were profound. How could this have been prevented? What motivated Tracy to involve her brother? And what would become of the family in the aftermath of such unimaginable betrayal? The night of the murders was only the beginning. It set in motion a chain of revelations, confessions, and legal battles that would captivate the nation. The layers of complexity, emotional tension, and human psychology embedded in this story would unfold over weeks, months, and years, each new detail more shocking than the last. The first responders arrived at the Reiner estate under the cover of night, summoned to a scene that would define their careers and leave an indelible mark on their memories. What they encountered was beyond anything they had prepared for. The sprawling Brentwood property, usually a haven of luxury and calm, had transformed into a tableau of horror. Multiple sharp force injuries claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner, two pillars of both Hollywood and family life. The gravity of the situation struck immediately. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. This was murder. Neighbors, first alerted by police activity and flashing lights, began to gather at a cautious distance. Conversations were hushed, whispers thick with disbelief. Many had known the Reiners for years, admired their grace, their warmth, their public presence. To reconcile the image of this beloved family with the scene before them was almost impossible. What kind of darkness could infiltrate a household that seemed so perfect from the outside? Questions swirled. How could this happen here? Who could have committed such a heinous act? Inside the estate, forensic teams worked meticulously, documenting every detail, every nuance, every trace of evidence. Each bloodstain, each object out of place, told a story that law enforcement would have to piece together carefully. It was immediately clear that the perpetrators were familiar with the household. Nothing had been forcibly entered, suggesting that the assailants were allowed access, or worse, invited in. The notion that someone close to the family could be involved began to take shape in the minds of investigators, though they tread carefully. As the investigation unfolded, attention quickly turned to Nick Reiner, the youngest son. He was present on the property and was subsequently arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media erupted with shock, speculation, and anger. Headlines screamed about the son who allegedly turned against his parents, and the media frenzy intensified with each passing hour. For many, it was unfathomable. How could a family that appeared so loving become the stage for such violence? Yet even as Nick's arrest sent shockwaves across Hollywood and beyond, the story was far from complete. Tracy Reiner's later confession would ultimately redefine the narrative. She admitted, in a courtroom packed with media and observers, that she had orchestrated the act, hiring her brother to commit what was already a shocking crime. The layers of betrayal deepened, transforming the tragedy from a single act of violence into a story of premeditation, manipulation, and moral complexity that no one could have predicted. The emotional impact of discovery extended beyond the immediate family. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances were left grappling with disbelief. Rob Reiner was not just a father and husband. He was a cultural icon whose work had touched millions. Michelle, known for her kindness and social engagement, was mourned by those who had admired her warmth. Their deaths were not only personal losses but public ones, sending ripples through Hollywood and the global audience who had followed their lives. Investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct the timeline. Each detail, from forensic evidence to witness statements, painted a picture of a calculated act. The crime scene revealed the brutality of the attack, but it also hinted at the psychological complexity behind it. The killers were deliberate, familiar with the home, and emotionally connected to the victims in ways that added layers of horror to the crime. Every piece of evidence reinforced the notion that this was not an impulsive act, but the culmination of intricate planning. Amidst the procedural rigor, the human element remained stark. Emergency responders recounted the difficulty of processing such a scene, the shock, the grief, the emotional weight of encountering lives so violently cut short. Even seasoned professionals found themselves grappling with the reality of a family destroyed from within, struggling to reconcile the familiar faces of the Reiners with the tragedy that had unfolded. The world outside Brentwood watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Media coverage framed the story as both a crime and a human drama, emphasizing the shocking involvement of family members. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation, opinion, and disbelief, turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle. Yet behind the headlines lay the deeper, more unsettling truth. A daughter had admitted to orchestrating a murder, a son had carried it out, and two beloved parents had lost their lives in their own home. The implications were staggering, raising questions about trust, loyalty, and the fragility of family bonds. The Reiner family tragedy became a case study in human complexity, highlighting how appearances can mask the most profound dysfunction. What looked like a serene, affluent household was, beneath the surface, a nexus of tension, resentment, and unspoken grievances. The discovery of the murders forced both the family and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. That the people we trust most, our children, our siblings, can, under certain circumstances, become the agents of unimaginable harm. Even as investigators documented every detail, the emotional repercussions rippled outward. Friends and extended family were left in disbelief, struggling to understand the motivations and decisions that led to such violence. The psychological impact on survivors, particularly Romy and other close relatives, was profound. Public perception was equally shaken. Hollywood, often familiar with scandal but rarely confronted with such intimate betrayal, watched closely. Colleagues of Rob Reiner expressed sorrow, shock, and disbelief, emphasizing the stark contrast between the public persona of the family and the hidden tensions that had erupted so tragically. Analysts and commentators dissected every detail, from the crime scene to the interpersonal dynamics, highlighting the unusual combination of fame, wealth, and intimate betrayal that made this case uniquely compelling. As the investigation deepened, one truth became increasingly clear: this was not a simple case of violent crime. It was a multi-layered tragedy, involving emotional manipulation, long-standing family tensions, and a betrayal so profound that it challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and loyalty. Tracy Reiner's eventual confession would illuminate these complexities, revealing motivations, pressures, and interpersonal dynamics that few had anticipated. The scene at the estate, the initial shock of discovery, and the immediate legal response were just the beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, the story would unfold in ways that combined legal drama, psychological insight, and the raw emotional impact of a family torn apart from within. The public would witness not only the consequences of a heinous act, but also the intricate web of relationships, decisions, and resentments that led to it. And as the first responders departed the estate, leaving behind the stark reality of death and devastation, one thing was certain. Nothing about the Reiner family would ever be the same. The public image of harmony and success had been shattered, replaced by a story of horror, betrayal, and shocking confessions. The arrest of Nick Reiner was swift, calculated, and immediately thrust the Reiner family into a maelstrom of public scrutiny. For law enforcement, it was the culmination of hours of investigation. For the media and public, it was the first concrete confirmation that the tragedy had roots far deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The youngest son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, once seen as a quiet, reserved presence within the family, was now facing the gravest of accusations: 2 counts of first-degree murder. Nick's life, up until that night, had been relatively private. While living in the guest house of his parents' sprawling Brentwood estate, he was largely shielded from the constant glare of the media, enjoying a measure of independence within the protective boundaries of family wealth. Friends described him as introspective, sometimes withdrawn, but also intelligent and capable. Yet, As investigators pieced together the events of that night, a very different narrative began to emerge. One in which Nick was at the center of a violent act that defied comprehension. The arrest itself was tense but procedural. Officers approached the guest house cautiously, aware that the suspect was not a stranger but a family member. There was no forced entry, no confrontation. Nick was cooperative yet visibly shaken. As he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of the situation began to sink in, both for him and for the world watching. Photographs and video footage quickly made their way into news outlets, showing a young man whose expression betrayed confusion, fear, and, perhaps, a dawning awareness of the consequences of his actions. From the outset, questions abounded. What motivated Nick to commit such a horrific act? Was it premeditated or a sudden eruption of long-simmering tension? Could love, resentment, or manipulation have driven a son to turn against his own parents? Legal experts immediately began dissecting the case, exploring possible defenses, and predicting the intense scrutiny that would dominate the courtroom. The implications were staggering, particularly because the alleged crime involved the orchestrating hand of another family member, Tracy Reiner, whose later confession would add layers of complexity and shock to the narrative. Public reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Social media erupted, with hashtags, speculation, and outraged commentary spreading like wildfire. Commentators debated motive, family dynamics, and the psychological profile of a young man accused of murdering his own parents. News anchors covered the story relentlessly, emphasizing both the celebrity status of the Reiners and the shocking betrayal at the heart of the case. The combination of fame, wealth, and familial crime made this story almost irresistible to a global audience, and it dominated headlines for weeks. For the family, the arrest was both confirmation and devastation. Romy, the youngest sibling, struggled to process the reality that her brother had been charged with the murder of their parents. Friends and relatives grappled with a complex mix of grief, disbelief, and anger. Within the estate, the echoes of laughter, conversation, and ordinary family life were replaced with silence, uncertainty, and the procedural demands of law enforcement. Every room, every hallway, every object in the house now carried the weight of tragedy, evidence, and memory. Investigators, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to establish the sequence of events. Forensics revealed the brutality of the attack, the premeditation involved, and the intimate knowledge required to navigate the estate with deadly intent. Officers meticulously documented every detail, from fingerprints to digital records, seeking to reconstruct not just what had happened, but why. In cases of familial violence, motives are often layered, combining resentment, manipulation, and psychological factors that defy simple explanation. Nick's arrest marked the first tangible step toward answering these questions, but it was clear that the full story would require much deeper exploration. The courtroom, once the domain of abstract legal principles, became a stage for intense human drama. Nick's demeanor, his statements, and the reactions of family members provided insight into the emotional complexity of the case. Observers noted the interplay of fear, guilt, confusion, and defiance, all of which painted a portrait of a young man caught in circumstances that were both extraordinary and horrifying. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, would be scrutinized for clues to motive, intent, and emotional state. And yet, the arrest was only the beginning. The revelation that Tracy Reiner had orchestrated the act transformed the narrative from a case of alleged parricide into a story of premeditated betrayal, manipulation, and moral ambiguity. Suddenly, the focus shifted from a single individual to a complex web of familial relationships, psychological pressure, and calculated decisions. The legal and emotional stakes skyrocketed, as both Nick and Tracy became central figures in a drama that extended far beyond the walls of the estate. Legal analysts noted the uniqueness of the situation. Cases involving family members committing violent acts are statistically rare, and those involving orchestration by another sibling are rarer still. This combination of proximity, manipulation, and emotional complexity created a scenario that challenged conventional understanding of motive, culpability, and justice. Every new piece of evidence added nuance, forcing the public to reconsider assumptions about family, loyalty, and the human capacity for harm. The arrest also had profound implications for mental health and family dynamics. Psychologists examining the case highlighted the interplay between personality, emotional history, and environmental pressures. Nick's actions could not be divorced from the years of tension, subtle resentment, and unspoken grievances that had accumulated in the household. Similarly, Tracy's orchestration could not be fully understood without examining her emotional state, her motivations, and the perceived injustices that may have driven her to manipulate her brother into committing a crime that would shock the world. The arrest sparked not only legal proceedings, but also intense media speculation. Headlines alternated between sensationalist framing and analytical commentary, each trying to grapple with the sheer complexity of the case. Public fascination grew, fueled by the combination of celebrity status, familial betrayal, and the moral questions embedded in the story. Audiences were drawn not merely to the crime itself, but to the human drama behind it, the relationships, the emotions, and the unfathomable decisions that led to tragedy. As Nick was taken into custody, the Reiner estate remained a silent witness to the events that had unfolded. Investigators continued their work, meticulously documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and preparing for the legal challenges ahead. The world watched as the narrative shifted from the shock of murder to the exploration of motive, manipulation, and familial betrayal. The arrest of Nick Reiner was a pivotal moment, but it was merely the opening act in a story that would continue to unfold with revelations that stunned even seasoned observers. And as the legal machinery began to turn, one thing became clear: this story was far from over. The initial shock of arrest would soon give way to deeper revelations, emotional confessions, and a level of betrayal that would leave the nation in disbelief. The courtroom was tense, electric with anticipation, as Tracy Reiner stepped through the doors for her first appearance. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and the air seemed thick with the weight of expectation. It wasn't just another celebrity trial. This was a case that had captured the attention of the entire nation. Everyone wanted to see Tracy Reiner, the daughter, the orchestrator, the woman whose shocking confession would later redefine the entire tragedy. But in that moment, all anyone could do was wait, to watch for the first glimpse of a person who seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple roles. A grieving daughter, a calculating planner, and a human being caught in the maelstrom of unimaginable circumstances. Tracy's entrance was striking not for ostentation, but for the subtle tension she carried. Observers described her as composed, yet there was a tremor in her hands, a slight tightness in her jaw, the kind of micro-expressions that betray the emotional chaos beneath the surface. It was clear that she understood the gravity of the situation. The court itself seemed to hold its breath as she approached the stand, each step echoing with the weight of her decisions, her confessions, and the public scrutiny she would soon endure. From the start, the stakes were extraordinary. Tracy's presence in court wasn't merely procedural, it was symbolic. The daughter of the victims, appearing before the judicial system not as a witness, but as someone implicated in orchestrating their deaths, shattered every conventional expectation of family loyalty and trust. The courtroom was filled with legal teams, family members, journalists, and onlookers, all grappling with the surreal reality that someone so intimately connected to the victims could play a role in their demise. As the proceedings began, Tracy's demeanor alternated between moments of quiet composure and visible emotion. Lawyers meticulously outlined the charges, the evidence, and the implications, while Tracy listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally swallowing hard. Each word, each gesture, was scrutinized by cameras, court reporters, and observers in the gallery. Even subtle expressions, a furrowed brow, a fleeting glance, became fodder for speculation, analysis, and judgment. The courtroom drama was amplified by the emotional intensity of the situation. For Tracy, this was not just a legal proceeding. It was the first public reckoning with her actions, a confrontation with consequences that would reverberate throughout her life and the lives of those around her. For the Reiner family, it was a moment of collective trauma, forcing siblings, relatives, and friends to navigate the complex intersection of grief, betrayal, and shock. Romy, in particular, sat quietly in the gallery, absorbing every detail, witnessing a sister's involvement in a tragedy that had already upended her world. Tracy's lawyers approached the proceedings with care, emphasizing the need to balance legal strategy with emotional sensitivity. They highlighted the complexities of familial dynamics, psychological pressures, and external influences that had contributed to the situation. At the same time, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture. One of deliberate orchestration, premeditation, and a breach of trust that defied comprehension. The contrast between legal framing and human emotion created a tense, almost cinematic atmosphere within the courtroom, a drama unfolding in real time before an audience of thousands watching through media coverage. The most shocking moment came when Tracy was called to speak, to address the court directly. Her voice, initially steady, carried the weight of emotion that words alone could not contain. She acknowledged her role in the events that led to her parents' deaths, a confession that sent waves of shock through the courtroom. The emotional impact was immediate. Gasps, tears, and murmurs punctuated the air as observers processed the reality of her admission. This was not a hypothetical scenario or a distant news story. This was a daughter admitting to orchestrating the deaths of her own parents. The gravity was almost unbearable. Tracy's emotional breakdown, captured on camera, revealed a complexity that transcended simple categorization. There was remorse, fear, guilt, and, paradoxically, a cold acknowledgement of the actions she had set in motion. Observers noted the oscillation between vulnerability and resolve, the way her eyes filled with tears even as her voice maintained clarity and conviction. This combination of raw emotion and deliberate admission created a narrative that was as compelling as it was horrifying. It forced the public to grapple with the duality of human nature, the capacity for love and for betrayal, sometimes coexisting within a single individual. Questions immediately arose about motive, mental state, and psychological influence. Experts in criminal psychology began analyzing Tracy's behavior, considering factors such as familial pressure, past grievances, perceived injustices, and the influence of long-standing sibling dynamics. How much of her decision was driven by manipulation, resentment, or emotional distress? Could remorse coexist with premeditation? The courtroom became a crucible for these questions, a space where law, psychology, and morality intersected in ways that left everyone present grappling for understanding. Public reaction mirrored the intensity of the courtroom. Social media exploded with commentary, speculation, and moral debate. Headlines emphasized the dramatic elements. Daughter confesses, family betrayal, Hollywood tragedy, while analysis delved into psychological and legal perspectives. Audiences were captivated not only by the events themselves, but by the human dimensions, the grief, the moral ambiguity, and the intricate web of relationships that made the crime so profoundly shocking. Tracy's first appearance also set the tone for the legal battles to come. Her confession, while deeply emotional, was just the beginning of a complex case that would involve meticulous evidence, witness testimony, and intense courtroom strategy. Lawyers, investigators, and experts understood that unraveling the truth would require patience, precision, and an unflinching look at the interplay between family dynamics and criminal behavior. Every detail mattered. Every word spoken could carry weight, and the stakes, both legal and emotional, were extraordinarily high. Yet, amidst the legal formalities and media scrutiny, the human story remained central. Tracy's presence, her words, her tears, and her admissions forced everyone in the room to confront uncomfortable realities, the fragility of trust, the consequences of unresolved conflict, and the terrifying capacity for betrayal within families. For the Reiner family, for observers, and for society at large, the courtroom became a stage for reckoning with the darkest aspects of human behavior. By the end of the first court appearance, one thing was clear: the tragedy was far from simple. It was not just a crime. It was a deeply human story of love, loyalty, and betrayal intertwined in ways that defied easy understanding. Tracy's role in orchestrating the act added layers of complexity, forcing a re-evaluation of motive, culpability, and the emotional stakes involved. The nation had witnessed a daughter confessing to orchestrating her parents' deaths, a reality that would continue to unfold in shocking and emotionally charged ways. And as Tracy left the courtroom, flanked by legal counsel and observed by the press, one thought lingered. This was only the beginning. The revelations, confessions, and courtroom drama that lay ahead would challenge perceptions, ignite debate, and leave the world grappling with questions that had no easy answers. It was a moment that would reverberate across the country, one of those rare instances when reality surpasses even the most sensational headlines. Tracy Reiner, standing in a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and family members, delivered a confession so shocking that it sent tremors through Hollywood, legal circles, and the public consciousness alike. She admitted, not hesitated, not skirted around, but explicitly admitted that she had orchestrated the murders of her own parents. She had hired her brother Nick to carry out an act that left Rob and Michelle Reiner dead at their Brentwood estate. The words hung in the air, almost impossible to fully absorb. A daughter had conspired to kill her parents, leveraging familial ties in a betrayal that defied comprehension. The courtroom went silent. Observers described a mixture of disbelief, horror, and fascination, as if the room collectively struggled to reconcile the image of Tracy Reiner, the caring daughter, the respected member of a famous family, with the reality of her confession. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled furiously, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Friends of the family who had followed the case closely were overwhelmed. Psychologists, journalists, and ordinary viewers alike began to analyze the confession, searching for motive, emotional triggers, or any shred of rationale that could make sense of such an unfathomable act. Tracy's emotional state during the confession was striking. At times, her voice trembled, revealing guilt, fear, and remorse. At other moments, her words were chillingly deliberate, showing a calculated clarity that suggested careful planning. It was this duality, the coexistence of regret and control, that made the confession so compelling and so horrifying. Observers couldn't help but feel a mixture of sympathy and revulsion, a psychological tug-of-war that mirrored the moral complexity at the heart of the tragedy. She explained, in painstaking detail, the dynamics that had led to her decision. The courtroom listened as Tracy described years of unresolved tension, perceived slights, and conflicts that had built into a pressure cooker of emotions. She painted a picture of a household where love and resentment coexisted, where loyalty collided with frustration, and where the bond between siblings became entangled with manipulation and coercion. According to her testimony, the decision to involve Nick was not